Every year, as December approaches, something extraordinary happens across the globe. Millions of people begin preparing for what they believe is the most sacred celebration in human history. They decorate trees, exchange gifts, gather with family, and sing songs about peace on earth and goodwill toward all. They light candles, hang wreaths, and tell stories of a miraculous birth that changed the world forever. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about Christmas is built upon one of the most elaborate deceptions ever perpetrated on humanity? What if the holiday you've celebrated your entire life, the traditions you've passed down to your children, the very date you mark as the birth of your Savior, is actually the result of a calculated lie that spans over 2,000 years? Tonight, we're going to peel back the layers of history and expose a truth so shocking that it will fundamentally change how you see December 25th forever. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory or anti-religious propaganda. This is documented historical fact, backed by archaeological evidence, scholarly research, and the written confessions of early church leaders themselves. We're talking about a systematic campaign of cultural theft and religious manipulation that makes modern marketing schemes look like child's play. The story I'm about to tell you involves ancient Roman emperors who worshipped the sun, Germanic tribes with sacred winter rituals, and Christian bishops who made deals that would make Wall Street executives blush. It's a tale of stolen traditions, rewritten history, and millions of people who were convinced to abandon their ancestral customs for what they thought was divine revelation. Before we dive into this rabbit hole, I need you to understand the magnitude of what we're discussing. Christmas isn't just slightly different from what you've been told. It's the complete opposite. The date has nothing to do with when Jesus was actually born. The traditions you cherish were practiced by so-called pagans for thousands of years before Christianity even existed. The customs you think honor Christ were originally designed to worship entirely different gods. And here's the most disturbing part. The people who created this deception knew exactly what they were doing. They left written records of their strategy. They documented their methods. They openly discussed how they were appropriating existing festivals and rebranding them as Christian holidays. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, calculated, and ruthlessly effective. To understand how this deception began, we need to travel back to the 3rd century of the Common Era, to a Roman Empire that was struggling with religious and political chaos. The old gods weren't working anymore. Traditional Roman religion was losing its grip on the population. People were searching for new forms of spiritual meaning, and dozens of mystery religions were competing for their attention. Into this spiritual marketplace stepped a small sect of Jewish followers who claimed their executed leader was actually the Son of God. These early Christians faced an enormous challenge. How do you convince people to abandon their deeply rooted traditions and convert to a religion based on the teachings of a crucified criminal from a backwater province? The answer, as we'll discover, was to not ask them to abandon their traditions at all. Instead, early Christian leaders developed a strategy that was as brilliant as it was dishonest. They would take the existing celebrations that people already loved and simply change the story behind them. Keep the party. Change the reason for celebrating. This strategy wasn't developed in isolation. Christian missionaries were encountering cultures across the Mediterranean world that had sophisticated religious traditions dating back thousands of years. These weren't primitive people dancing around fires. These were civilizations that had developed complex theological systems, advanced astronomical knowledge, and deeply meaningful seasonal celebrations. The winter solstice, in particular, was sacred to virtually every culture in the Northern Hemisphere. This wasn't superstition or ignorance. For agricultural societies living without modern technology, the return of the sun after the longest night of the year was literally a matter of survival. These cultures created elaborate festivals to mark this cosmic turning point, celebrations that were rich with symbolism, community bonding, and spiritual significance. Among the most powerful of these celebrations was the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun. This wasn't some minor local observance. By the 3rd century, Sol worship had become central to Roman imperial ideology. Emperor Aurelian had elevated Sol Invictus to the highest levels of the Roman pantheon, making December 25th one of the most important dates in the imperial calendar. The festival celebrating the birth of the sun god was massive. We're talking about empire-wide celebrations that lasted for days. Chariot races thundered through the Circus Maximus. Public feasts fed thousands of citizens. Elaborate ceremonies honored the deity who brought light back to the world after the darkness of winter. The entire population participated in honoring the sun, god whose victory over darkness guaranteed another year of life and prosperity. This wasn't just religious theatre. Sol Invictus represented hope, renewal, and the triumph of life over death. For ordinary Romans, this festival provided psychological comfort during the harshest time of the year. It promised that spring would return, that crops would grow again, that the cycle of life would continue. The symbolism was profound, and the emotional impact was undeniable. But Sol Invictus wasn't the only winter celebration that captivated the Roman world. There was another festival that was even more beloved by the common people, a celebration so popular that it had become woven into the very fabric of Roman social life. Saturnalia was the most anticipated event of the entire year, a time when the normal rules of society were temporarily suspended and people could experience freedoms that would be unthinkable during the rest of the calendar. Originally lasting just one day, Saturnalia had expanded by the imperial period into a week-long celebration that transformed the entire empire into what we might recognize today as the world's largest party. From December 17th through the 23rd, Roman society turned upside down in the most delightful ways imaginable. During Saturnalia, slaves didn't work and were invited to join their masters at the dinner table. In some households, the social hierarchy was completely reversed, with servants being served by their owners. People abandoned their formal togas for comfortable, colourful clothing. Gambling, normally restricted or forbidden, was not only permitted but encouraged. The greeting Io Saturnalia echoed through every street and household as people celebrated with an enthusiasm that modern partygoers would recognise and envy. The gift-giving during Saturnalia was legendary. Romans exchanged presents with friends and family members, with popular items including wax candles, called cerae, small oil lamps, and decorative figurines. These weren't random trinkets. Each gift carried symbolic meaning tied to the season, and the festival's themes of light conquering darkness and community bonds strengthening during difficult times. Roman homes were transformed during Saturnalia with decorations that should sound familiar to anyone who has ever prepared for Christmas. Wreaths made from evergreen branches adorned doorways and windows. Garlands of holly and other winter plants were hung throughout houses. Tables groaned under the weight of elaborate feasts, featuring special seasonal foods and plenty of wine that had finally finished fermenting and was ready to drink. The parallels to modern Christmas celebrations are so obvious that you'd have to be deliberately blind not to notice them. The gift exchanges, the decorative greenery, the special seasonal foods, the emphasis on family gatherings, the general atmosphere of joy and celebration during the darkest time of year. These weren't Christian innovations. They were Roman traditions that had been practiced for centuries before the first gospel was ever written. But Rome wasn't the only civilization celebrating the winter solstice with elaborate festivals. Across northern Europe, Germanic and Norse peoples had developed their own rich traditions centered around what they called Yule. This wasn't a single-day observance, but a 12-day celebration that began with the winter solstice and continued through the new year. The Norse Yule traditions are particularly striking because they contain elements that modern people immediately recognize as Christmas customs. The Yule log, dragged into homes and burned throughout the celebration, provided warmth and light during the darkest nights. Evergreen trees were brought indoors and decorated with lights and ornaments as symbols of life persisting through winter's death. Special Yule foods were prepared, including a Yule ham that held deep religious significance. Perhaps most remarkably, the Norse believed that during the 12 days of Yule, the god Odin would lead a ghostly procession called the Wild Hunt across the winter sky. Odin, known as the Yule Father, was said to visit homes during this time, bringing gifts to children and blessings to families, a bearded paternal figure flying through the winter sky and delivering presents to children during a 12-day celebration centered around decorated trees and family gatherings. Does any of this sound familiar? These weren't isolated traditions practiced by a few scattered tribes. We're talking about sophisticated cultures with complex religious systems that had been developed over hundreds, possibly thousands of years. The symbolism was consistent across different regions and peoples. Evergreen vegetation represented life surviving through apparent death. Gift-giving strengthened community bonds during times of scarcity. Light ceremonies encouraged the return of the sun. Family gatherings provided psychological support during the most challenging season of the year. When Christian missionaries began expanding into these territories, they encountered a problem that was far more complex than simple religious conversion. They weren't just asking people to change their theological beliefs. They were asking them to abandon cultural practices that had sustained their communities for countless generations. You couldn't simply tell a Germanic warrior to stop celebrating Yule. You couldn't explain to a Roman citizen that Saturnalia was somehow evil or wrong. These festivals weren't just entertainment. They were integral to how these cultures understood the rhythm of the seasons, the structure of community life, and their relationship with the forces of nature. So Christian leaders made a decision that would echo through history for the next 2,000 years. Instead of competing with these beloved traditions, they would absorb them. They would take the existing celebrations and gradually rebrand them as Christian observances. This wasn't some organic evolution of religious practice. This was a calculated strategy of cultural appropriation designed to make Christianity more appealing to potential converts while simultaneously weakening competing religious systems. The genius of this approach was that it allowed people to maintain their cherished traditions while appearing to convert to the new faith. You could continue celebrating exactly as you always had, gathering with family, exchanging gifts, decorating your home, and enjoying elaborate feasts. The only difference was that you now had to accept a new explanation for why you were doing these things. For most people, this seemed like a reasonable compromise. They got to keep everything they valued about their winter celebrations, while gaining access to the social and political advantages that came with being part of the emerging dominant religion. It was a win-win situation that made everyone happy. Everyone, that is, except for those who understood what was really happening. Because while ordinary people were making what seemed like minor adjustments to their religious explanations, Christian leaders were carrying out one of the most audacious acts of cultural theft in human history. They weren't just borrowing a few harmless customs or making minor theological adjustments. They were systematically dismantling the religious foundations of entire civilizations and rebuilding them under Christian authority. And they documented every step of the process. Pope Gregory the Great, writing in the year 601, laid out this strategy with chilling clarity in his correspondence with Christian missionaries. He didn't suggest destroying pagan temples. Instead, he ordered them converted into churches. He didn't recommend eliminating pagan festivals. He commanded they be transformed into Christian celebrations. This was official church policy, written down and distributed throughout the expanding Christian world. The calculated nature of this deception becomes even more apparent when you examine the timeline of events. For over 3 centuries after Christ's supposed death, Christians showed absolutely no interest in celebrating his birth. The apostles never mentioned it. The early church fathers ignored it completely. The first Christian communities were focused on Christ's death and resurrection, not his arrival into the world. This silence is deafening when you consider how central Christmas has become to modern Christianity. If Jesus' birth was truly the momentous occasion that churches claim it to be, why did it take his followers over 300 years to start commemorating it? Why is there no biblical mandate for celebrating December 25th? Why did the people who were supposedly closest to the source show no interest in marking this date? The answer becomes clear when you realize that Christmas wasn't created to honor Jesus. It was created to compete with Sol Invictus. The first documented evidence of Christians celebrating Christ's birth on December 25th appears in Roman records from the year 336, just 62 years after Emperor Aurelian had established the Sol Invictus festival as one of the empire's most important religious observances. 62 years. That's not divine revelation. That's market research. That's the amount of time it took for Christian leaders to analyze their competition, identify their weaknesses, and develop a counter-strategy that would allow them to capture market share in the Roman religious economy. But the deception went far deeper than simply choosing a convenient date. Early Christian leaders were facing a fundamental credibility problem that threatened to destroy their movement before it could gain momentum. The story they were trying to sell sounded remarkably similar to myths that were already circulating throughout the Mediterranean world. Long before the Gospel writers put pen to parchment, ancient cultures were already telling stories about divine figures born on December 25th to virgin mothers. The Egyptian god Horus was said to emerge from the virgin Isis on this exact date. The Persian deity Mithras, whose worship was incredibly popular among Roman soldiers, shared this same miraculous birthday. The Greek god Dionysus, the Babylonian Tammuz, even the Roman Sol Invictus himself, all supposedly born on December 25th to virgin mothers. These weren't coincidental similarities. This was a well-established mythological template that existed throughout the ancient world. The dying and rising god narrative, the virgin birth story, the December 25th birthday. These were common elements in mystery religions that had been captivating audiences for centuries before Christianity appeared on the scene. When early Christian writers were crafting their version of the Jesus story, they weren't working in an intellectual vacuum. They were operating in a world where people already had specific expectations about what their savior figures should look like and how their stories should unfold. Virgin births weren't shocking or unprecedented. They were practically required if you wanted your religious movement to be taken seriously by sophisticated audiences. The Gospel writers were essentially creating a marketing document designed to appeal to people who were already familiar with these mythological patterns. They took the existing template that had proven successful for other mystery religions and adapted it to fit their particular theological agenda. This wasn't divine inspiration. This was strategic religious product development. But here's where the story takes an even more sinister turn. Once Christianity gained political power under Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, the Church began systematically destroying evidence of these earlier traditions. They didn't just want to compete with existing religions. They wanted to eliminate any trace that those religions had ever existed. The destruction was methodical and thorough. Libraries containing thousands of scrolls and manuscripts were burned to ash. Temples that had stood for centuries were demolished or converted into churches. Scholars and priests who refused to convert were persecuted, exiled, or killed. Entire civilizations' worth of religious knowledge, philosophical writings, and historical records were deliberately erased from human memory. The famous Library of Alexandria, once the greatest repository of human knowledge in the ancient world, was destroyed by Christian mobs who considered its pagan texts dangerous and heretical. Countless temples throughout the Roman Empire were torn down, eliminating physical evidence of the religious traditions that had inspired Christian practices. The goal was to make Christianity appear original and unique by destroying any evidence that would reveal its borrowed origins. This wasn't accidental destruction caused by the chaos of war or the passage of time. This was a deliberate campaign to rewrite history itself. Church leaders understood that if future generations had no access to information about pre-Christian religions, they would never be able to recognize the theft that had taken place. If you eliminate all evidence of the original myths, your version becomes the only version anyone remembers. The scale of this historical vandalism is staggering when you really consider its implications. We're talking about the deliberate destruction of thousands of years of human cultural development, philosophical traditions that had taken centuries to mature, artistic expressions that represented the highest achievements of their civilizations, scientific knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered for hundreds of years. All of it burned, demolished, or buried because it contradicted the Christian narrative of their own divine origins. The Church created an artificial historical timeline where Christianity appeared to emerge fully formed, completely original, with no debt to earlier traditions. They rewrote the story of their own beginnings to make themselves look more legitimate and divinely inspired. But despite this systematic campaign of historical erasure, evidence survived. Archaeological discoveries continue to unearth artifacts that reveal the true scope of pre-Christian religious sophistication. Surviving manuscripts hidden in remote monasteries preserve fragments of the knowledge that church authorities tried to eliminate. Comparative mythology studies demonstrate the connections between Christian stories and earlier traditions. Modern scholars have access to information that was deliberately hidden from previous generations. We can now see the full picture of how Christianity developed, how it borrowed from existing sources, and how it covered its tracks through violence and deception. The evidence is overwhelming for anyone willing to examine it honestly. Yet most Christians remain completely unaware of this history. They celebrate Christmas believing they're honoring the birth of their Savior, never realizing they're participating in rebranded pagan festivals that have nothing to do with Jesus Christ. They put up Christmas trees without knowing they're continuing traditions that ancient Druids used to honor forest spirits. They exchange gifts without understanding they're following customs that Romans practiced during Saturnalia. The irony is profound and deeply troubling. Christians spend December condemning secularization and commercialization, complaining that Christmas has lost its religious meaning, without realizing that the holiday never had the Christian meaning they think it possessed. Christmas was always secular. It was always commercial. It was always about celebrating the winter solstice with parties, gifts, and family gatherings. The religious overlay was added artificially as a marketing strategy to make Christianity more appealing to potential converts. Jesus was grafted onto existing winter festivals the same way a corporate logo might be added to a popular product to boost sales. The spiritual significance that modern Christians attribute to Christmas traditions was never actually there. But the most disturbing aspect of this deception isn't the historical fraud itself. It's the ongoing psychological manipulation that prevents people from recognizing the truth, even when it's presented to them clearly. The Church has spent centuries conditioning believers to reject any information that challenges their worldview, no matter how well documented or academically supported that information might be. When you try to explain the pagan origins of Christmas to most Christians, they don't respond with curiosity or interest in learning more about history. They become defensive, angry, sometimes even hostile. They'll insist that the historical origins don't matter because the traditions have been given new meaning. They'll accuse you of trying to attack their faith or ruin their holiday celebrations. This defensive reaction isn't natural or spontaneous. It's the result of psychological conditioning that's been built into Christian culture over many generations. Believers are taught from childhood that questioning religious traditions is dangerous, that examining historical evidence is less important than maintaining spiritual beliefs, that doubting church teachings is a sign of weak faith. The Church has created a mental firewall that automatically rejects any information that might undermine Christian claims about their own origins and development. This conditioning is so effective that many believers will continue celebrating Christmas exactly as they always have, even after learning about its pagan roots. They'll compartmentalize the information, treating it as interesting but irrelevant to their personal faith experience. But for some people, discovering the truth about Christmas becomes a gateway to questioning everything else they've been taught about Christianity. If the church lied about this fundamental celebration, what else might be false? If Christian traditions are borrowed from paganism, what does that say about Christian theology itself? If church leaders were willing to engage in such systematic deception, how can anything they teach be trusted? These are dangerous questions from the institutional church's perspective, which explains why they work so hard to prevent people from asking them. The entire structure of organized Christianity depends on believers accepting religious authority without question, following traditions without examining their origins, and maintaining faith despite contradictory evidence. The Christmas deception reveals the methods that religious institutions use to gain and maintain power over their followers. It shows how cultural appropriation, historical revisionism, and psychological manipulation can be combined to create belief systems that serve institutional interests rather than spiritual truth. And once you understand how this deception works, you can never look at Christmas the same way again. At Christmas the same way again. Every December 25th, when families gather around their twinkling trees and children tear open brightly wrapped presents, they're unknowingly participating in a ceremony that would be instantly recognizable to a Roman citizen from 2,000 years ago. The only difference is that the Roman would be celebrating the birth of Sol Invictus, while modern families believe they're honoring Jesus Christ. This substitution wasn't gradual or accidental. It was orchestrated by church officials who understood exactly what they were doing when they hijacked the most popular celebration in the Roman Empire. And we know this because they wrote about their strategy in letters and documents that survive to this day. The evidence becomes even more damning when you examine what early Christian leaders actually said about December 25th. Pope Leo I, who led the Catholic Church in the 5th century, was dealing with a congregation that literally bowed to the sun as they entered St. Peter's Basilica. Think about that image for a moment. Christians, supposedly devoted followers of Jesus, stopping to worship the sun god before entering their own church. Pope Leo knew exactly why this was happening. In his Christmas sermons, he explicitly scolded Christians who believed their Christmas celebration came from what he called the rising of the new sun. He wasn't confused about the connection between Christmas and sun worship. He understood perfectly that his congregation was mixing Christian faith with solar veneration because church leaders had deliberately placed Christmas on the sun god's birthday. But instead of being honest about this calculated decision, instead of explaining to his followers that December 25th had been chosen for strategic reasons, Pope Leo simply condemned the behavior and demanded that Christians stop acknowledging the obvious link between Christmas and ancient solar festivals. He knew the truth, but he chose deception over transparency. This pattern of deliberate dishonesty appears throughout the historical record. Church leaders consistently demonstrate that they understood the pagan origins of their traditions, while simultaneously lying about those origins to their followers. They documented their own fraud in official church correspondence, yet somehow this information never made it into Sunday school lessons. The Syrian bishop Jacob of Sarug, writing in the 12th century, was even more explicit about what had occurred. In manuscript annotations that survived the centuries, he explained that pagans had originally celebrated the sun god's birthday on December 25th, and that Christians participated in these festivals. When church leaders realized that Christians were drawn to this celebration, they made a conscious decision to rebrand it as a Christian holiday. This wasn't speculation or theory. This was an official church document acknowledging that Christmas was deliberately created to co-opt existing pagan celebrations. The church literally confessed to its own deception, yet managed to keep this information hidden from the general population for over 1,000 years. The level of calculation involved in this religious fraud becomes even more apparent when you examine the broader context of early Christian expansion. Church leaders weren't just making random decisions about dates and traditions. They were conducting what we would recognize today as sophisticated market analysis to determine the most effective strategies for growing their movement. They studied the religious landscape of the Roman Empire with the precision of modern corporate strategists. They identified the most popular festivals and analyzed why these celebrations appealed so strongly to ordinary people. They examined the emotional and psychological needs that existing traditions fulfilled. They researched the seasonal rhythms that govern people's lives and the community bonds that held societies together. Armed with this intelligence, they designed a religious product that would meet all the same needs while advancing their own theological agenda. It was spiritual marketing at its most cynical and effective. They essentially reverse-engineered the most successful elements of competing religions and repackaged them with Christian branding. But they went far beyond simple imitation. Once they had successfully appropriated these traditions, they launched a coordinated campaign to eliminate any memory of their original sources. This wasn't just about winning converts or competing with other religions. This was about fundamentally altering human collective memory to serve their institutional interests. The scope of this historical revision was breathtaking. Entire libraries containing thousands of scrolls were reduced to ash. Temples that had stood for centuries were systematically demolished. Scholars who possessed knowledge of pre-Christian traditions were persecuted into silence or exile. Art, literature, philosophy, and scientific knowledge that contradicted Christian claims were deliberately destroyed. The Celtic Druids, for instance, were renowned throughout the ancient world for their sophisticated understanding of astronomy, medicine, law, and natural philosophy. Their educational system required 20 years of study to master. Their seasonal celebrations weren't primitive rituals, but carefully designed psychological and social technologies that helped communities navigate the challenges of living in harmony with natural cycles. When Roman and later Christian authorities eliminated Druidic culture, they weren't just destroying a religion. They were erasing an entire system of human knowledge that had taken centuries to develop. The same pattern was repeated across Europe as Christianity expanded. Germanic shamanic traditions, Norse mythological systems, Slavic folk wisdom. All of it was systematically eradicated to prevent future generations from recognizing what had been stolen. The destruction wasn't limited to Northern European cultures. Mediterranean mystery religions that had flourished for hundreds of years were also targeted for elimination. These weren't crude superstitions, but sophisticated theological systems that had explored fundamental questions about the nature of divinity, human consciousness, and the structure of reality. The Mithric mysteries, popular among Roman soldiers, had developed elaborate initiation ceremonies and moral codes that emphasized courage, loyalty, and spiritual purification. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece offered profound spiritual experiences that transformed participants' understanding of life and death. The Egyptian Isis cult provided comfort and hope to millions of people across the ancient world. All of these traditions contained elements that would later appear in Christianity, but they had developed these concepts independently over centuries of religious evolution. When Christian authorities destroyed the temples, burned the texts, and silenced the priests of these traditions, they were eliminating evidence that would have revealed the borrowed nature of Christian innovations. The psychological impact of this cultural destruction was devastating for the populations that experienced it. Imagine having your ancestral traditions, your seasonal celebrations, your connection to the natural world, and your understanding of the sacred suddenly declared evil and forbidden. Imagine being told that practices your people had followed for generations were now considered devil worship. But the cruelest twist was that these same traditions were simultaneously being appropriated and rebranded as Christian innovations. The evergreen trees your ancestors had decorated during winter solstice celebrations were now called Christmas trees. The gift exchanges that had strengthened community bonds during the darkest time of year were now explained as commemorating the wise men's presents to baby Jesus. The seasonal feasts that had marked the return of the sun were now said to celebrate the birth of the Son of God. You could continue practicing the same rituals, following the same customs, and maintaining the same seasonal rhythms, but you had to accept a completely different explanation for why you were doing these things. And if you refused to accept the new Christian interpretation, you faced persecution, exile, or death. This created an impossible psychological situation for ordinary people. They could either abandon the winter celebrations that had sustained their communities for countless generations, or they could participate in the Christian version while suppressing their knowledge of its true origins. Most people chose the latter option, not because they were convinced by Christian theology, but because it was the only way to preserve their cherished traditions. This survival strategy had profound long-term consequences. Within a few generations, most people had lost conscious awareness of the pre-Christian origins of their winter celebrations. Children grew up learning only the Christian explanations for traditions that were actually thousands of years older than Christianity itself. The collective amnesia was so complete that when modern scholars began rediscovering the pagan roots of Christmas traditions, many Christians reacted with genuine shock and disbelief. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to associate these practices with Jesus that learning about their actual origins felt like a personal attack on their faith. But the historical evidence is undeniable for anyone willing to examine it honestly. Archaeological discoveries, comparative mythology studies, and surviving manuscripts all point to the same conclusion. Christmas is a hybrid celebration that combines stolen pagan traditions with a fabricated Christian narrative designed to make the appropriation seem legitimate. The parallels between Christmas customs and pre-Christian winter festivals aren't subtle similarities that require scholarly interpretation to detect. They're exact matches that would be obvious to anyone who took the time to compare them side by side. The gift-giving, the decorated trees, the seasonal feasts, the emphasis on family gatherings, the celebration of light conquering darkness. Every major element of Christmas was practiced by pagan cultures centuries before the Gospel of Matthew was written. Even the date itself reveals the calculated nature of this deception. December 25th was already one of the most sacred days in the Roman religious calendar, long before Christians decided to claim it as Jesus' birthday. The winter solstice had been marked by elaborate celebrations across the Northern Hemisphere for thousands of years before Christianity even existed. When church leaders chose this specific date, they weren't following biblical guidance or divine revelation. They were making a strategic business decision designed to capture market share in the competitive religious economy of the late Roman Empire. They identified the most popular existing celebration and simply rebranded it with Christian symbolism. The success of this strategy was remarkable. Within a few centuries, Christianity had managed to co-opt the most beloved festivals of multiple civilizations while convincing people that these celebrations had always been Christian. The rebranding was so effective that modern believers genuinely think Christmas traditions originated with their religion, but success came at a price that we're still paying today. The Christmas deception established a pattern of institutional dishonesty that has characterized organized Christianity throughout its history. It demonstrated that religious authorities were willing to lie to their followers if it served their institutional interests. It showed that sacred traditions could be manufactured through marketing rather than authentic spiritual experience. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed that religious truth claims could be successfully maintained even when they contradicted overwhelming historical evidence. The Christmas lie proved that belief could triumph over facts if the deception was sophisticated enough and the psychological conditioning was thorough enough. This has profound implications that extend far beyond questions about holiday traditions. If church leaders were willing to engage in such elaborate fraud about something as fundamental as when Jesus was born, what other aspects of Christian doctrine might be built on equally shaky foundations? If the institutional church has demonstrated such a consistent pattern of deception and cultural appropriation, how can any of its claims be trusted? These questions become even more troubling when you realize that the Christmas deception wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader strategy of religious colonization that continued for centuries. The same methods used to appropriate winter solstice festivals were applied to spring celebrations, harvest rituals, and life cycle ceremonies throughout Europe and eventually around the world. Everywhere Christianity spread, the pattern was the same. Identify popular local traditions, rebrand them with Christian symbolism, eliminate evidence of their original meanings, and claim them as divine revelations. It was cultural imperialism disguised as spiritual enlightenment, and it was remarkably effective at expanding Christian influence while destroying competing worldviews. But the victims of this deception weren't just the cultures whose traditions were stolen. The deception also harmed the Christian believers, who were taught to base their faith on fabricated foundations. When you build your spiritual life on lies, you inevitably face a crisis when the truth eventually emerges. And the truth about Christmas is just the beginning of a much larger reckoning with the methods that organized religion has used to gain and maintain power throughout human history. The psychological conditioning that prevents most Christians from seriously examining these questions is itself evidence of how deeply the deception has penetrated. When people become angry or defensive at the mere suggestion that their cherished traditions might have non-Christian origins, they're demonstrating the effectiveness of centuries of religious programming designed to protect institutional authority from critical examination. But that programming is beginning to crack as more people gain access to historical information that was once hidden in academic journals and specialized libraries. The internet has democratized access to scholarly research, archaeological discoveries, and comparative religious studies. Information that was once available only to university researchers is now accessible to anyone with curiosity and an internet connection. This creates an unprecedented opportunity for people to discover the truth about their religious traditions and make informed decisions about what they actually believe. For the first time in centuries, ordinary believers have the tools to fact-check the claims made by religious authorities. They can examine the evidence for themselves and reach their own conclusions about what deserves their faith and what deserves their skepticism. The Christmas deception is an ideal starting point for this investigation because the evidence is so clear and the implications are so profound. Once you understand how this particular lie was constructed and maintained, you begin to see similar patterns throughout religious history. You start asking different questions about other sacred traditions. You become more skeptical of claims about divine revelation and more curious about human motivations behind religious movements. And that curiosity, that willingness to examine evidence rather than simply accepting authority, represents the greatest threat to institutional religious power since Christianity first began appropriating pagan festivals 2,000 years ago. The transformation wasn't just spiritual, it was economic, political, and social. When Christianity absorbed these ancient festivals, it wasn't simply changing people's religious beliefs. It was fundamentally restructuring entire civilizations and redirecting their cultural energy toward new centers of power. Consider what happened to the economic systems that had grown around these traditional celebrations. For centuries, local craftsmen had specialized in creating ritual objects for winter solstice festivals. Skilled metalworkers forged ceremonial vessels for Germanic tribes. Talented woodcarvers created intricate figurines for Roman Saturnalia celebrations. Master weavers produced special textiles that marked sacred seasons across northern Europe. When Christianity appropriated these traditions, it didn't eliminate the demand for ceremonial objects. Instead, it redirected that economic activity toward Christian institutions. The same craftsmen who had once created pagan ritual items were now producing Christian ceremonial goods. But the profits from this production increasingly flowed toward church coffers rather than local communities. This economic centralization was part of a larger pattern of resource concentration that accompanied Christian expansion. Traditional festivals had been decentralized celebrations that strengthened local bonds and kept wealth circulating within communities. Christian holidays, by contrast, required pilgrimages to distant shrines, donations to far-off monasteries, and tribute to hierarchical church structures. The social implications were equally profound. Pagan winter celebrations had typically been community affairs where social hierarchies were temporarily suspended or even inverted. During Saturnalia, slaves could mock their masters. During Germanic Yule festivals, ordinary farmers could challenge tribal chiefs to contests of strength or wit. These traditions provided psychological release valves that helped maintain social stability throughout the rest of the year. Christian Christmas celebrations, however, reinforced existing power structures rather than challenging them. Church authorities used the holiday to emphasize themes of submission, obedience, and acceptance of divine authority. The message wasn't that social hierarchies could be questioned or playfully subverted, but that they were ordained by God and should be respected even during times of celebration. This shift in social messaging had lasting consequences for how European societies understood power relationships. The temporary inversions and playful challenges to authority that had characterized pagan festivals were replaced by ceremonies that sanctified existing inequalities. Christmas became a tool for social control rather than social release. The political dimensions of this transformation were perhaps even more significant. Traditional winter festivals had been expressions of local identity and cultural independence. When Germanic tribes celebrated Yule, they were asserting their connection to ancestral traditions and their resistance to foreign influence. When Celtic communities marked the winter solstice, they were maintaining spiritual practices that had sustained their people through countless generations of external pressure. Christianity's appropriation of these festivals served to break down local resistance to imperial authority. By rebranding traditional celebrations as Christian holidays, church officials effectively neutralized one of the most powerful sources of cultural cohesion that might have opposed Roman expansion and later medieval centralization. The psychological warfare aspect of this strategy was particularly sophisticated. Rather than openly attacking beloved traditions, which would have provoked immediate resistance, Christian authorities embraced these celebrations while gradually changing their meaning. People were allowed to continue practicing familiar rituals, but the stories that gave those rituals significance were slowly rewritten to serve Christian purposes. This approach was far more effective than direct confrontation would have been. When you tell people they can't celebrate their most cherished festivals, they rebel. When you tell them they can continue celebrating but need to understand their traditions differently, most people accept the compromise. They get to keep the emotional satisfaction of familiar rituals, while avoiding the social costs of resistance to the dominant culture. But this compromise came with hidden costs that became apparent only over time. As Christian interpretations became standardized and alternative explanations were suppressed, people gradually lost access to the original meanings that had made their traditions spiritually nourishing. The rich symbolism that connected winter celebrations to natural cycles, community bonds, and cosmic rhythms was replaced with simplified narratives about divine intervention and religious obedience. The psychological impoverishment that resulted from this process was profound, though often invisible to those experiencing it. Traditional celebrations had served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. They provided opportunities for emotional catharsis, social bonding, spiritual reflection, and cultural transmission. They helped people navigate the psychological challenges of seasonal transitions and maintained connections between human communities and natural environments. When these multifaceted celebrations were reduced to simplified religious observances focused on a single theological message, they lost much of their psychological effectiveness. Modern Christmas celebrations, while still emotionally significant for many people, often feel hollow or commercialized compared to the deep spiritual satisfaction that ancient winter festivals apparently provided. This spiritual emptiness helps explain why contemporary Christmas celebrations are so heavily dependent on external stimulation, the constant marketing, the emphasis on material consumption, the frantic activity that characterizes the modern holiday season. These may be unconscious attempts to recreate the profound emotional impact that original winter solstice celebrations once provided through their connection to natural rhythms and community bonds. The commercialization that many Christians complain about isn't a recent corruption of an originally pure religious celebration. It's the inevitable result of trying to maintain emotional engagement with traditions that have been severed from their authentic spiritual roots. When you remove the genuine meaning from cultural practices, you have to substitute artificial excitement to maintain people's interest. This dynamic reveals something crucial about the relationship between authenticity and sustainability in cultural traditions. Practices that emerge organically from genuine human needs and observations about natural patterns tend to remain meaningful across generations. Traditions that are artificially constructed or appropriated for institutional purposes tend to degrade over time, requiring increasingly elaborate external supports to maintain their emotional impact. The Christmas deception demonstrates this principle on a massive scale. What began as a strategic appropriation of genuinely meaningful celebrations has evolved into a holiday that many people find more stressful than spiritually nourishing. The elaborate preparations, the financial pressures, the family tensions that often accompany modern Christmas celebrations may reflect the psychological strain of trying to find authentic meaning in artificially constructed traditions. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why discovering the true origins of Christmas can be either liberating or devastating for individual believers. Some people experience relief when they learn that their vague sense of spiritual emptiness around the holiday has a historical explanation. They realize that their dissatisfaction isn't a personal failing, but a natural response to participating in traditions that have been disconnected from their authentic sources. Other people, however, experience the revelation as a profound loss. If Christmas traditions aren't authentically Christian, then what does that say about the spiritual experiences they've associated with the holiday? If their most cherished celebrations are built on borrowed foundations, how can they trust their own religious instincts about anything else? This psychological crisis often extends beyond questions about Christmas to broader doubts about religious authority and spiritual truth. When people realize they've been systematically lied to about something as fundamental as their most important holiday, they naturally begin questioning other aspects of their religious education. The institutional credibility that took centuries to establish can unravel remarkably quickly once people start examining the evidence for themselves. Church leaders understand this vulnerability, which explains their typical response to questions about Christmas origins. Rather than engaging with historical evidence, they usually deflect toward discussions of current meaning and personal faith experience. They encourage believers to focus on how Christmas makes them feel, rather than examining what Christmas actually represents historically. This deflection strategy works for many people because it allows them to maintain their emotional attachment to familiar traditions while avoiding the uncomfortable cognitive dissonance that comes from acknowledging historical facts that contradict religious claims. It's psychologically easier to say that origins don't matter than to face the implications of systematic institutional deception. But for people who value intellectual honesty and historical accuracy, this deflection strategy is deeply unsatisfying. The question isn't whether Christmas celebrations can provide meaningful experiences in the present. The question is whether those experiences are built on truthful foundations or elaborate lies. And for many people, the foundation matters enormously for determining the authenticity and value of the experience itself. The broader implications of the Christmas deception extend far beyond individual spiritual crises to fundamental questions about how human societies construct and maintain meaning systems. If one of the most successful cultural institutions in human history was built through systematic appropriation and historical revisionism, what does that suggest about the reliability of other meaning-making institutions? The methods used to create and maintain the Christmas deception weren't unique to early Christianity. Similar patterns of cultural appropriation, historical revisionism, and psychological manipulation appear throughout human history whenever powerful groups seek to expand their influence over existing populations. Political movements, economic systems, and social hierarchies all employ variations of these same techniques to establish and maintain legitimacy. Understanding how the Christmas lie was constructed provides a template for recognizing similar deceptions in other contexts. The combination of strategic appropriation, systematic destruction of contradictory evidence, and psychological conditioning that prevents critical examination appears repeatedly across different times, places, and institutions. This pattern recognition has practical implications for navigating contemporary information environments, where similar manipulation techniques are employed by various authorities seeking to shape public opinion and behavior. The same psychological vulnerabilities that made the Christmas deception possible continue to make people susceptible to other forms of institutional manipulation. But knowledge of these patterns also provides tools for resistance. When you understand how meaning systems are artificially constructed and maintained, you become better equipped to evaluate claims critically rather than accepting them based on authority alone. You develop the intellectual tools necessary to distinguish between authentic traditions that emerge from genuine human experience and manufactured traditions designed to serve institutional interests. The Christmas revelation thus serves as more than just historical education about holiday origins. It becomes a lens for examining all forms of received wisdom and cultural authority. It encourages the kind of critical thinking that institutions fear most, the willingness to examine evidence independently and reach conclusions based on facts rather than faith. This intellectual independence represents a fundamental threat to any system that depends on unquestioned authority for its legitimacy, whether religious, political, or economic. Institutions that rely on manufactured consent rather than genuine agreement must prevent their subjects from developing the analytical tools necessary to recognize manipulation. The Christmas deception succeeded for centuries because most people lacked access to the historical information necessary to evaluate church claims critically. They had to accept religious authority because they had no alternative sources of knowledge about their own cultural traditions. The systematic destruction of pre-Christian texts and artifacts ensured that contradictory evidence remained hidden from public view. But that information monopoly is breaking down in the modern era. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal evidence of sophisticated pre-Christian cultures whose achievements were deliberately obscured by Christian historians. Comparative mythology studies demonstrate the borrowed nature of supposedly unique Christian innovations. Digital archives make historical documents accessible to ordinary people who were once dependent on religious authorities for information about the past. This democratization of information creates unprecedented opportunities for people to discover authentic connections to their ancestral traditions, while freeing themselves from artificially constructed meaning systems that serve institutional rather than human interests. The truth about Christmas is just the beginning of a much larger process of historical recovery and cultural reclamation. For many people, learning about the real origins of Christmas becomes a gateway to exploring other suppressed aspects of human cultural heritage. They discover that their ancestors weren't primitive, superstitious people who needed to be saved from ignorance, but sophisticated cultures with profound insights about natural cycles, community relationships, and spiritual development. This recovery of historical perspective can be profoundly healing for people who have felt disconnected from authentic sources of meaning and purpose. Rather than depending on institutional authorities to interpret reality for them, They can reconnect with wisdom traditions that emerged from thousands of years of human observation and experimentation. The psychological impact of this reconnection often extends far beyond intellectual understanding to encompass emotional and spiritual dimensions that had been suppressed by artificial religious constraints. People report feeling more grounded, more connected to natural rhythms, and more confident in their ability to navigate life's challenges without external religious guidance. This personal transformation, when multiplied across large numbers of people, has the potential to create significant cultural shifts that could reshape how human societies understand their relationship with natural environments, community bonds, and spiritual development. The Christmas deception may have succeeded in dominating human consciousness for 2 millennia, but its exposure opens possibilities for cultural renewal that could extend far into the future. The question is whether enough people will have the courage to examine the evidence honestly and act on what they discover, or whether the psychological conditioning that protects institutional authority will prove too powerful to overcome. The answer to that question will determine not just how we celebrate December 25th, but how we understand the relationship between truth and tradition in human culture more broadly. The transformation that occurred when Christianity absorbed these winter celebrations wasn't just about changing religious labels. It represented a fundamental shift in how human beings understood their relationship with the natural world, their communities, and their own spiritual development. What we're witnessing in the Christmas deception is nothing less than the systematic rewiring of human consciousness on a civilizational scale. Consider the profound difference between celebrating the winter solstice, as your ancestors did for thousands of years, and celebrating Christmas as the Church instructed. The original winter celebrations were deeply connected to observable natural phenomena. People could see the sun reaching its lowest point in the sky. They could feel the cold intensifying and the darkness growing longer each day. They could witness firsthand the moment when the light began to return and the promise of spring emerged from winter's grip. These weren't abstract theological concepts that required faith to believe. They were tangible experiences that anyone could verify through direct observation. The celebrations that grew around these natural cycles were grounded in reality, connected to the rhythms that governed agricultural societies, and meaningful in ways that touched every aspect of daily life. When Christianity replaced these reality-based celebrations with faith-based alternatives, something crucial was lost. Christmas asks people to believe in events they can never verify, to celebrate stories that may or may not have historical basis, and to find meaning in narratives that exist primarily in the realm of theology rather than observable experience. This shift from empirical observation to religious belief had profound consequences for how human societies developed their understanding of truth, knowledge, and reliable sources of information. Pre-Christian cultures had developed sophisticated methods for observing natural patterns, testing practical knowledge, and distinguishing between reliable information and speculation. When Christianity gained dominance, it introduced an entirely different epistemological framework that prioritized faith over observation, authority over experience, and revealed truth over empirical investigation. This wasn't just a change in religious practice. It was a fundamental alteration in how human beings were taught to process information and evaluate claims about reality. The Christmas deception serves as a perfect example of how this new epistemological framework operated in practice. Instead of encouraging people to observe natural cycles and develop their own understanding of seasonal rhythms, Christianity taught them to accept stories about divine intervention that couldn't be verified through direct experience. Instead of building celebrations around phenomena that everyone could witness and participate in, the Church created holidays based on theological claims that required institutional interpretation to understand. The locus of authority shifted from personal observation and community wisdom to centralized religious institutions that claimed exclusive access to divine truth. This transformation had cascading effects that extended far beyond religious practice to encompass science, philosophy, politics, and social organization. When you train people to accept claims based on authority rather than evidence, you create a population that's vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who can establish themselves as a credible authority figure. The same psychological mechanisms that made the Christmas deception possible also enabled other forms of institutional control that shaped European civilization for the next 15 centuries. People who had been conditioned to accept religious claims without empirical verification were also more likely to accept political claims, economic theories, and social arrangements without demanding evidence for their validity. This helps explain why the period following Christianity's rise to dominance was characterized by such remarkable intellectual stagnation in many areas of human knowledge. When empirical observation is devalued in favor of received authority, scientific progress becomes much more difficult. When questioning fundamental assumptions is discouraged as dangerous to faith, philosophical development slows dramatically. The contrast with other civilizations that maintained different epistemological frameworks is striking. While Christian Europe was burning libraries and suppressing scientific inquiry during the medieval period, Islamic scholars were preserving Greek philosophical texts, advancing mathematical knowledge, and making groundbreaking discoveries in astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. The difference wasn't intellectual capacity or cultural sophistication. The difference was the epistemological framework that governed how knowledge was acquired, validated, and transmitted. Civilizations that maintained respect for empirical observation and rational inquiry continued to advance. Civilizations that subordinated observation to faith experienced intellectual decline. The Christmas deception illustrates this dynamic perfectly. The sophisticated astronomical knowledge that enabled ancient cultures to calculate solstices accurately and create meaningful seasonal celebrations was gradually replaced by simplified theological narratives that discouraged further investigation. Instead of teaching people to observe celestial mechanics and understand their relationship to seasonal changes, Christianity taught them to focus on stories about divine births and miraculous interventions. The shift from astronomy to theology represented a fundamental dumbing down of human understanding about natural phenomena. But the intellectual damage went deeper than just replacing scientific knowledge with religious stories. The Christmas deception also demonstrated how institutional authorities could manipulate historical memory to serve their current interests. By systematically destroying evidence of pre-Christian traditions and rewriting the origins of their own practices, church leaders established a precedent for historical revisionism that would be repeated countless times throughout subsequent centuries. This manipulation of historical memory wasn't just about winning theological debates or competing with other religions. It was about establishing the principle that powerful institutions have the right to control information about the past in order to maintain their authority in the present. Once this principle was established and accepted by populations who had been conditioned not to question religious authority, it became much easier for other institutions to engage in similar forms of historical manipulation. Political leaders could rewrite inconvenient historical facts. Economic elites could obscure the origins of their wealth. Social hierarchies could invent noble pedigrees to justify their privileges. The Christmas deception thus served as a template for institutional lying that extended far beyond religious contexts. It demonstrated that sophisticated psychological manipulation could convince entire populations to accept false narratives about their own cultural heritage, and that these false narratives could be maintained across multiple generations through careful control of information and education. The success of this strategy encouraged other institutions to adopt similar methods for managing public opinion and behavior. The same techniques used to convince people that Christmas was originally Christian were later used to convince people that various political systems were divinely ordained, that economic arrangements were natural and inevitable, and that social hierarchies were based on merit rather than manipulation. Understanding how the Christmas deception worked thus provides insights into much broader patterns of institutional control that continue to operate in contemporary societies. The psychological vulnerabilities that made medieval populations susceptible to religious manipulation remain present in modern populations, even though the specific content of the manipulation has evolved. The fundamental dynamic remains the same. Powerful institutions identify popular cultural practices or beliefs, appropriate them for their own purposes, rewrite their origins to serve institutional interests, suppress contradictory information, and condition people to accept the revised narrative without critical examination. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout modern history in contexts ranging from political propaganda to corporate marketing to social movements. The methods pioneered by early Christian leaders for managing public consciousness have been refined and adapted by successive generations of institutional authorities seeking to shape human behavior for their own benefit. But recognizing these patterns also provides tools for resistance. When you understand how institutional manipulation works, you become better equipped to identify it in contemporary contexts. When you know how historical narratives are constructed and maintained, you become more skeptical of official stories about current events. The Christmas revelation serves as training for developing the kind of critical thinking skills that modern citizens need to navigate information environments dominated by institutional authorities with their own agendas. Learning to question religious claims about holiday origins prepares you to question political claims about national security, economic claims about market efficiency, and social claims about meritocracy. This intellectual preparation is crucial because the stakes of institutional manipulation have grown enormously since the medieval period, when church authorities manipulated information about Christmas origins. They were primarily concerned with expanding their religious influence and maintaining social control within relatively small populations. Contemporary institutional authorities operate on a global scale with access to technologies that would have seemed miraculous to medieval minds. Their ability to shape public consciousness and manipulate behavior has expanded exponentially, while most people's ability to access independent sources of information has not kept pace. This creates an urgent need for populations to develop the analytical tools necessary to evaluate institutional claims critically, rather than accepting them based on authority alone. The Christmas deception provides a historical case study that demonstrates both how manipulation works and how it can be exposed through careful examination of evidence. But perhaps most importantly, the Christmas revelation opens possibilities for cultural renewal that extend far beyond simply correcting historical misinformation. When people understand that their most cherished traditions were stolen from ancestral cultures with profound wisdom about natural cycles, community relationships, and spiritual development, they gain access to alternative approaches to meaning-making that don't depend on institutional mediation. This recovery of cultural heritage can be profoundly liberating for people who have felt trapped within artificial meaning systems that serve institutional interests rather than human flourishing. Instead of depending on religious authorities to interpret reality for them, they can reconnect with traditions that emerged from thousands of years of direct human experience with natural environments and community relationships. The psychological benefits of this reconnection often include increased sense of grounding, greater confidence in personal intuition, and reduced dependence on external validation from institutional authorities. People report feeling more authentic, more connected to natural rhythms, and more capable of navigating life's challenges without requiring constant guidance from religious, political, or economic institutions. When multiplied across large numbers of people, this individual transformation has the potential to create significant cultural shifts that could reshape how human societies organize themselves and relate to natural environments. The Christmas deception may have succeeded in dominating human consciousness for 2 millennia, but its exposure creates opportunities for cultural renewal that could influence human development for generations to come. The question that remains is whether enough people will have the intellectual courage to examine the evidence honestly and the emotional resilience to act on what they discover. The psychological conditioning that protects institutional authority runs deep, and the social pressures to conform to conventional narratives remain powerful. But the information necessary to understand the truth about Christmas and its implications for broader questions of institutional credibility is now more accessible than ever before. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the sophistication of pre-Christian cultures. Historical documents that were once hidden in specialized archives are now available through digital libraries. Comparative studies that demonstrate the borrowed nature of supposedly original Christian innovations are published in academic journals that anyone can access. The tools for intellectual independence exist. The question is whether people will choose to use them or continue accepting comfortable lies that protect them from the unsettling responsibility of thinking for themselves. The answer to that question will determine not just how future generations celebrate December 25th, but whether human societies will continue to be dominated by institutional authorities who manipulate consciousness for their own benefit, or whether people will reclaim the intellectual autonomy necessary for authentic cultural development. So, there you have it, the most celebrated holiday in the world, the cornerstone of Christian tradition, built on a foundation of lies, theft, and calculated deception spanning 2,000 years. Christmas isn't the birth of a savior. It's the birth certificate of institutional manipulation on a scale that would make modern propagandists weep with envy. Every December 25th, billions of people unknowingly bow before stolen altars, singing borrowed songs, and celebrating rebranded pagan festivals while believing they're honoring a god who had nothing to do with their creation. The next time someone wishes you a Merry Christmas, remember what you're really celebrating. Not divine revelation, but the triumph of religious marketing over historical truth.